Hello, friends. Um, okay, well, we're going to talk a little bit today about Jack London and Call of the Wild. And yeah, probably wondering why I keep wearing a hat. Well, basically, it's because I really need a haircut. That's one of the main reasons here. And yeah, so I'm covering my haircut needing head, basically. So yeah, let me just start with this. I miss seeing you all out there. I mean that sincerely. This is getting into the last week of school, and I start thinking we get to say our goodbyes and wishing graduating seniors well and that kind of thing. And so I feel sad that we don't get to do that in person, and I mean that sincerely. So again, my best to everybody in the midst of this. And if you need to talk to me about anything, please call. The number is 432-638-3785. Okay, well, welcome to my house. I'm in my study here. And so we'll talk a little bit about Jack London. And folks did a good job on the discussion boards, the two on Jack London, and folks were really trying to puzzle through some complicated issues about, he finally meets John Thornton, but, did he ultimately have to break away from John in order to realize who he really is, be true to his inmost nature? Those are really complicated questions. So what's really at the heart of that, there's this really complex dynamic between civilization and the primitive. And it's not a straightforward black and white kind of issue, nor is good and evil. Sometimes we see utter brutality being made possible by civilization, chasing after gold and rounding up dogs. That's the stuff of civilization. So there is this horrific primitive quality even in what we think of as being civilization. Yet in the wild, what we think of as being, nothing but a Darwinistic law of the jungle, eat or be eaten kind of thing, there's room for love. John Thornton is very much a product of the wild, and so is Buck. Yet there's room for devotion and compassion, even out in the wild. So it's complicated. And it really is a story we have to give more credit to, I think. For years and years and years, it was taught. Well, let me put it this way. At one time, it was a much more popular book than it is now. It was taught especially to boys, maybe teenagers, adolescents, basically, especially boys, to teach them about, how to toughen up and be men. Maybe not quite as much now, but scholars continue to pay a lot of attention to this book because on the surface, it seems to be a book that's designed for young adults and, maybe not so much for adults and certainly not scholars. But there's a lot of complexity in here that has been keeping scholars busy, really right up to the present. So let's jump into it this way. The first question that I had you discussing was about, how is this a work of realism? And I was angling for something, or at least preparing you for something that I wanted to talk about in this lecture. And you were, an awful lot of folks were really right on the money about recognizing, yes, there does seem to be, there seems to be forces of realism at work, a lot that the book seems to have in common with Daisy Miller or Edith Wharton, that there are just these forces out there that folks have to operate in that are absolutely out of their control. Daisy Miller, gender expectations, Hugh Wolf, forces of capitalism, that kind of thing. And so, yes, you're seeing that kind of thing here, but to a much, much greater degree. And so just so you know that there is a method to the madness. There's kind of a last mini unit that we're getting into here. We've been talking about works of realism all semester long. Henry James, Mark Twain, Kate Chopin, Edith Wharton, they're typically considered to be masters of realism, okay? But there's another literary movement we're looking at this semester, and that's called naturalism. Naturalism. So if I were in the classroom and I had a blackboard over here, I'd put that in big letters up on the blackboard. So I'd like you to write that down now. I hope you all are still taking notes over these lectures. Naturalism. Call of the Wild and Maggie are both considered to be works of naturalism. And to a degree, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's story, The Yellow Wallpaper, works of naturalism. So let me start this, next part of this lecture, let me just say a few words about how, what naturalism is and how this book illustrates this literary movement called naturalism. And again, if you have any questions, I can't wait for you all to raise your hands out there, but you can post comments on Canvas, okay? And I hope you'll do that. But, okay, well, first of all, so naturalism then. Basically, maybe one way, here's a quick shorthand, how to define naturalism. Naturalism is like extreme realism, realism to the 10th power, something like that. And one way to describe what naturalism is not, naturalism, don't confuse that with romanticism, whereas there's a desire to return to nature. We're going to be like Thoreau or Emerson or William Wordsworth, and we're going to go out to nature to feel peace and calm and tranquility and develop this sense of calm spirituality and inspiration. That's not how we're meeting naturalism. Really, the naturalism that we're talking about in this movement, it comes from Darwin. The law of the jungle, survival of the fittest, that kind of thing. Eat or be eaten. These primitive qualities, there's this struggle to survive. And, there's a competitive struggle to survive that seems to be at the root of nature. And as a lot of writers like Jack London and Stephen Crane were starting to consider, that there is this competitive, primitive struggle to survive that's at the root of human nature also. That's in there, but civilization has maybe quieted that down. Get us out into the jungle or get us out into the Yukon, and it'll come out again, all right? So that's what we're meaning by naturalism. When we say naturalism, think Darwin, survival of the fittest, okay? And yes, Cassidy brought up a point that I think I need to touch on here, that survival of the fittest has to do with who gets to reproduce. And that's very true. I mean, you do see that with Buck at the end of the book, when he's truly wild and free, and he's free of John Thornton. There are all these little puppies that start popping up all over the place that bear a striking resemblance to Buck. Okay, you see what I'm getting at? So he is the fittest, and he does, in fact, get to reproduce, unlike a lot of the other dogs that just die off, right? Okay, so there you go. Okay, so first of all, in realism, the realism that we get in Huckleberry Finn, or the realism we get in Edith Wharton or Daisy Miller, it's the everyday. It's the present. It's in circumstances we might find ourselves in if we walk down the street in New York City, or whatever. People are utterly believable, utterly everyday, very much in the present moment. Okay, so that's very real. Now, setting then in works of naturalism, are true and in the present, but they're not every day. They're horrific. Okay, going off into the Yukon and being beaten with a club. Yes, that kind of thing would happen, but it's horrific. Other settings in naturalist novels tend to be battlefields, war zones. One famous work of naturalism, Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. Maybe some of you have heard of that or read it. It's set out on a Civil War battlefield. Yes, it's true, it's real, but it's a horrific form of reality. Or Stephen Crane, we're reading his book Maggie. It takes place in the Bowery in New York City. Tenements in New York City, showed you pictures of those way back at the beginning of the semester. Horrific. Poverty, abject poverty, brutality, alcoholism, violence, the whole mess. So it's horrific. Even in The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the setting is in a converted insane asylum, or even a haunted house, or this nursery. It's a place of insanity. Okay, so again, the setting is horrific. It's not every day, like with Daisy Miller or Huck Finn. Okay, so if you look over on page 15, you'll see this. Some of you probably have other editions. So this is very beginning at chapter 2, first paragraph in chapter 2, when he's off in, making his way up to the Yukon. Buck's first day on the Daya Beach was like a nightmare. So there you go, it's horrific. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. He had been suddenly jerked from the heart of civilization and flung into the heart of things primordial. No lazy, sun-kissed life was this, etc., etc. Here was neither peace nor rest nor a moment's safety. It's horrific, horrific. All was confusion and action, and every moment life and limb were in peril. There was imperative need to be constantly alert, for these dogs and men were not town dogs and men. They were savages, all of them, who knew no law but the law of club and fang. I think some of you even drew on this passage in your writings, and that was very good. Puts it right out there for you. Setting is not exactly realistic. It's real, it's believable, but it's horrific. It's extreme realism. That's setting, setting for naturalism. What about human nature? Human nature with a classic realist writing like in James or Twain, it's, in a lot of these folks, like in the, consider the Shepherdsons, and dang it, I'm drawing a blank. Who are the Shepherdsons in having that conflict with the feud? It'll pop in my head in just a second. Sorry. That they were yeah, I mean, they're scratch the surface and they're very brutal people, but they're also capable of genuine goodness. They took in Puck Finn and were willing to give him a home and care for him and everything else. So human nature is kind of a mixed bag. Or look at Winterbourne. You know, on the surface, he seems like an okay guy, and Daisy Miller, but underneath the surface, you're seeing a lot of hypocrisy and all that. So human nature is kind of an uneasy balance between good and not so good. Or in Daisy Miller herself, you know, you see in her this desire for freedom that's utterly admirable, but at the same time, this incredible naivete. So human nature is a mixed bag. What about human nature here in Jack London? What about human nature in Maggie that y'all are starting to read? Whew, boy, with some very, very rare exceptions. Folks are just awful. Folks are just awful. I mean, you can't, people are utterly unworthy of trust. If you look on page 7, this is a little bit into chapter 1. Buck had accepted the rope with quiet dignity. This is when Buck is being kidnapped, stolen. To be sure, it was an unwanted performance, but he had learned to trust in men he knew. So, okay, you trust people. Not here. Never in all his life had he been so vilely treated, and never in all his life had he been so angry. But his strength ebbed, his eyes glazed, and he knew nothing when the train was flagged and the 2 men threw him into the baggage car. So he's being fully introduced into the pure savagery that is human nature. It is not safe to trust anyone. Okay, and then over on page 12. Okay, this is towards the end of chapter 1. Again, human nature is pretty bad, he's discovering. He was beaten, he knew that, but he was not broken. The club was a revelation. It was his introduction to the reign of primitive law. So, yes, primitive and kind of horrific. And you can't really show who you are. You can't be open and vulnerable because this is what happens. Mercy, kindness can be interpreted as weakness, and it could get you killed. So this is still in chapter 2. Okay, this is on to chapter 2, second page into chapter 2. So that was the way. No fair play. So Curly gets killed by the other dogs. Once down, that was the end of you. Well, he would see to it that he never went down. So he's understanding to survive. He's learning how to survive in these horrific circumstances. Okay. And then another thing over on page 54. So he's got to sharpen and develop his instincts and everything else. Okay, so this is on page 54. This is in the chapter, The Foil of Trace and Trail. Chapter 5. This is when he's with Mercedes and Hal. And how can I put this? Maybe you noticed this, that there's a little bit of sexism that's coming out in London here. He seems to be saying that the primitive, the wild, seems to be a place only for men. Women, even females, female dogs, right? One of the first dogs that he sees to die is a female dog called Dolly, okay? So, yeah, that's some sexism in here. Clearly, female wolves do just fine out there. So this is some sexism on London's part. And you see this coming out in the way that he describes Mercedes, this woman here. Mercedes nursed a special grievance, the grievance of sex. She was pretty and soft and had been chivalrously treated all her days, but the present treatment by her husband and brother was everything save chivalrous. It was her custom to be helpless. They complained, upon which impeachment of, it just goes on to say, right, Howe begged her to get off and walk, pleaded with her, entreated, the while she wept and importuned heaven with a recital of their brutality. So, yeah, women seem utterly unfit to be out in the wild here. As the old saying goes, women are the weaker sex. And so the weaker sex just ain't going to do very well out here. And so you could say, well, okay, doesn't have anything to do with who women are in and of themselves. It has everything to do with the way Mercedes was, or Mercedes in German pronunciation, the way she was raised in civilization. It's because she was treated, put up on a pedestal and, confined in the domestic sphere and all that stuff. So that's why she's not doing very well out here. It has everything to do with nurture, the way she was treated. And that's why she's not doing so well here. In that case, that could be a feminist message here. Okay, maybe. Maybe. Actually, I'd love to know what you all think about that. But there's some evidence here also that Jack London is trying to say that women are by their nature weaker than men. And we learned a little bit about hysteria when talking about Charlotte Perkins Gilman, that women, because of their biology, because of their feminine biology, that made them weaker. That made them prone to hysteria. And you can nurture women all you want, educate them and do whatever all you want. But the fact is, biologically, because of female biology, they will remain weaker. And there's a little bit of that comes out here, I hate to say it, on page 58. So here they are, they're just about ready to, this is when Mercedes and company are about to go and fall into the lake. And Hal has just been, not Hal, Buck has just been rescued. So, very end of chapter 5, Thornton stood between him and Buck and evinced no intention of getting out of the way. Hal drew his long hunting knife. Mercedes screamed, cried, laughed, get this, manifested all the chaotic abandonment of hysteria. So this is what's wrong with Mercedes here. She's suffering from hysteria. Maybe if Jack London had a say, he'd subject her to the rest cure. Just saying, do with that what you will, okay? All right, that's probably enough here for part 1. I'll pause here. I'm gonna go make a cup of tea. Nice civilizing effects of a cup of tea. Gonna go enjoy that, and then we'll come back and have part 2. Okay? All right.